power and impact of the United States Senate is far-reaching, from the ability to write and pass laws.
This confirmation process has become a national disgrace.
To confirm or reject the president's nominees, including for the U.S. Supreme Court.
November is coming. November is coming.
Tonight we get answers from the three men who want to be your senator. They are Independent Angus King, the incumbent and former governor, Democratic nominee and educator Zach Ringelstein, and Republican nominee and state senator Eric Brakey. It's the CBS 13 Fox 23 U.S. Senate debate, sponsored by AARP Maine and the Bangor Daily News. And it begins right now. And a good evening and warm welcome to all of you to the Maine U.S. Senate debate. You're going to hear extensively from the candidates in just a moment. First, though, we're aware, as you may be as well, that the BDN recently endorsed, I should say the BDN editorial board recently endorsed a candidate in this race, Angus King. We want to stress up front that, as always, that editorial board did not participate in the planning or moderation of this debate in any way. CBS 13 worked solely with the news department of the BDN and political reporter Michael Shepard, who you'll hear from in just a moment. Also want to tell you, CBS 13 has vetted and reviewed all the questions you'll hear tonight, including those that will come from AARP Maine. So with that said, right up front, onto the debate. And we want you to be a part of this, an active part of this debate as well. Jennifer Long, my colleague, joins us now with more on that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Greg. Over the next hour, as you watch the discussion live on our website or online, you might have a question or a thought about this debate. And while you're not physically here, you can still voice your opinions. It is easy to chime in. Go to our page on Facebook. That is facebook.com/WGME13. You can also give your input on Twitter. Use the hashtag #YourVoiceYourFuture. I'll be watching both of those accounts all night, and we'll be getting your questions and comments to our panel. For now, Greg, I'll send it back to you.
All right, Jen, thanks very much. And tonight we are skipping any introductory remarks. We feel you know the candidates probably pretty well at this point, so we want to get right to our first question. This weekend, our nation did endure another tragedy. 11 people were murdered and several more wounded by a gunman, specifically, according to investigators, using an AR-15, one of the most popular guns in America. Some are now calling for renewed restrictions or tighter restrictions on this type of high-powered firearm. Others, including President Trump, are saying that perhaps houses of worship should be better armed themselves, that armed guards perhaps at the doors. We want to know what the candidates think about this issue. Let's begin, based on the random drawing we did in advance of this debate, with the incumbent Senator Angus King. You have 1 minute, please.
Well, I think my first response is I don't think armed guards in every house of worship in America makes sense, or in every school building, in every community building. I just don't think that's the answer to this problem. I do think there are two elements that are in play in this terrible tragedy, and I just literally came to this building from a community vigil at Bet Am Synagogue in South Portland. One is mental health. We've got to do a much better job of understanding what's going on in people's minds and how to prevent and how to get the signals that something like this might be coming. The second is keeping guns out of the hands of people that shouldn't have them. To me, that means universal background checks. It also means banning things like bump stocks that turn a semi-automatic rifle into an automatic rifle. On assault weapons, I realize that's a very passionate issue. The problem is a so-called assault weapon, you mentioned an AR-15, is nothing but a semi-automatic hunting rifle like thousands of people in Maine use, that looks different. It has a different design. I'm not into symbolism and cosmetics. My problem is if you ban the design, somebody will just design around that and you'll still end up with the same kind of weapon. The key to me is universal background checks, keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them.
All right, thanks very much. Senator Eric Brakey, you have 1 minute as well, please.
So gun control simply doesn't work because criminals don't obey the gun laws that we pass. I mean, we already have it against the law to commit murder, and that's not stopping them. You know, I'm proud of the fact that in the Maine Senate, one of the biggest accomplishments I'm known for was I built a bipartisan coalition to pass constitutional carry so that all law-abiding citizens can carry a concealed handgun without the need for a government permission slip in order to defend themselves. In fact, 4 out of the top 5 safest states in America are constitutional carry states, with Maine being at the top of the list. We're the safest state in America. These tragedies that take place across our country are just that. They're terrible. They're tragic. And 92% of all mass shootings take place in gun-free zones. The idea that we're going to put a sign up or put a law in place and criminals are suddenly going to change their nature is absurd. It's a false sense of security. We need to be able to ensure our safety. We need to be able to defend our Second Amendment and our own lives. That's why I have an A+ with the NRA, while Angus has a D with the NRA.
Thank you very much. Zach Ringelstein, you have 1 minute as well for the same question.
Thank you, Greg. I think this is a very somber day and week for America. And I think we need to name what is going on here. We have 11 Americans who were killed in their place of worship, one of whom was a Holocaust survivor. She survived the Holocaust. And America is supposed to be a safe place. Now, she wasn't killed by accident. She was killed by a white nationalist, a white supremacist, incited by Trump's rhetoric and, quite frankly, by Eric Brakey's rhetoric, and by the complicity of many who are trying to pretend like this isn't a crisis because they want to score political points. Now, just this weekend, Eric said something to the effect of leftists and globalists want to replace us with refugees. They want to import our population, including dangerous killers seeking to infiltrate Western countries. Violent rhetoric leads to violent actions. Eric, this is disgraceful. You should be ashamed of yourself. And quite frankly, we should not have someone who is working really with and sympathizing with neo-Nazis on this stage tonight. Thank you.
Your 1 minute is up, but we're going to extend as we do. Our format here for the folks at home is if a candidate chooses to challenge another candidate during their answer time, we then will extend after everyone's had a chance to answer to the person who's been challenged. Obviously, Eric Brakey, the floor is yours to respond if you wish.
Thank you, Greg. Look, we all know that Zach is polling at 9 points in the polls. He's obviously desperate for attention. And, you know, Zach, I guess if I was going to give you a piece of advice.
That's ridiculous and untrue.
Excuse me, Zach. I'm speaking right now. I didn't interrupt you when you were speaking. If, you know, you talk a lot about civil dialogue, but you don't actually really seem to be that committed to it. You're doing a lot of name-calling, a lot of ad hominem attacks, and frankly, that quote is not even, anyway, it's not even the words that I've said. So, you know, so frankly, Zach, I'll give you some advice. If you want to do better in the polls, maybe stop being a lapdog for Angus King, and maybe you might actually be doing better. We could have some contrast on some of the issues and some serious policy discussion here. I'm here today because we have a serious choice to make as a state. We've been getting a bad deal here in Maine for a very long time. We are now, on the United States level, we're $21 trillion in debt. We have $113 trillion in unfunded liabilities. We are at a place where that's $1.1 million for every single American taxpayer. And Angus, you know, you voted to rack up $5 trillion of that. You left the state of Maine $1 billion in debt. You've been one of the biggest spenders in Washington, D.C. I think that we deserve a better deal. We deserve to be able to have better jobs, better health care. We deserve to be able to make our own choices in our own lives without the city 500 miles away telling us how to live.
All right, hold on a second, Mr. Ringelstein. We want to extend to Senator King. I actually, first of all, wanted to say, if you want to respond to, he mentioned the NRA ratings between him and yourself, if you wanted to address that, since he mentioned you. Also, he just mentioned you as well when it comes to debt. That's a little off topic, but if you'd like to respond.
Well, I voted for appropriations bills to keep the government running. I'll certainly plead guilty to that. These were bills that were passed overwhelmingly with a bipartisan vote, both parties. President Trump signed them. So this is part of the governmental process, and I wasn't going to try to shut down the government over some issue or another, which some people tried to do. So I think, you know, we're working, and I've suggested ways that we can cut the budget, that we can cut expenditures. One way involves negotiating for prescription drugs, which would lower prices for seniors and the taxpayers, $25 billion a year. So there are a lot of opportunities, I think, to save and to save the taxpayers' money and to move toward what we all ought to aspire to, which is a balanced budget.
And Zach Ringelstein is indicating he'd like to jump in.
Yes, I want to say this is not a normal time with Trump as our president and with this violent rhetoric. And the Portland Press Herald did something that they don't typically do, which is they wrote a letter today calling Eric Brakey's comments abhorrent, dehumanizing, and said that he needs to have the maturity to be in the U.S. Senate. Now listen, we need to start calling this stuff out. And I'd actually like to see Angus, Senator King, you participate in calling white supremacy out, both with Trump and with Eric. This is not normal. This is not okay in the United States of America. We fought World War II for a reason.
And in fairness, obviously the topic is still on gun control and gun rights, so let's...
Though in fairness, when I had a debate with Zach, he seemed to think that the Second Amendment was racist too, so maybe we are on topic.
Let's have Angus King respond to something that Mr. Ringelstein just brought up as well, if you wish.
I think we should move.
All right, fair enough. Mr. Ringelstein, did you want to reference to what, is that something that you said about
Well,
the
I think if Eric is tired of being called a racist, maybe he should stop saying things that are, in fact, racist.
All right, and if you can have the final word on this subject, Mr. Brakey.
You know, frankly, not everyone who opposes the open borders agenda is a racist. I mean, frankly, Bernie Sanders opposes open borders, who I think you aspire to. You know, we need to have secure borders in our country. I'm the only candidate in this race who supports secure borders, and that's about economics. Zach, I know you have trouble with economics, but this is about economics. A Nobel Prize-winning economist, Milton Friedman, said it's just obvious you can't have open borders in a welfare state. Both of my opponents seem to want to have both of those things.
All right,
he said only candidate. I've got to take issue with that. In 2013, I voted for the strongest border security provision ever proposed in the United States Congress. It was designed by Senator Bob Corker, Republican of Tennessee. We got 68 votes. 2/3 of the Senate voted for that bill, including me. So nobody here is talking about open borders. That's a red herring.
I have to respond to that. Senator King, in the 1990s, when you were governor, you called for open borders, and during your term in the U.S. Senate, you co-sponsored a bill by a leftist Democrat Senator Dianne Feinstein, which would have allowed which would have given all illegal immigrants coming across the border a free pass provided they had a kid with them, and with no way to verify if that was actually their kid or if that was someone kidnapped on the other side of the border by drug cartels.
I'm going to go ahead and jump in at this point. This again was a topic of gun control. We've now, and gun rights. We've now talked about
I guess it's all connected.
Border security. Well, our interest here as the viewers as well is to continue the conversation. So I'm going to allow some latitude, obviously, but if we can, I'm going to try to move on to our next question as well. And I'm getting a question. I do think that we want to move on to this other question since this segues out of what we've been talking about. Our next question does involve the migrant caravan that's making its way through Mexico and from Honduras. The migrants themselves say that they're trying to escape poverty and seek a better life at this point, but President Trump is deploying more than 5,000 troops right now to the border, saying that this represents a threat to our sovereignty. In fact, there's an audio clip we want to play for the folks at home and for the candidates. Here's what the president, some of what he's had to say on this topic.
And in that caravan, you have some very bad people. You're going to find MS-13, you're going to find Middle Eastern, you're going to find everything. There's no proof of anything. There's no proof of anything, but they could very well be.
All right, let's get your thoughts on this topic. We've started talking about border security issues and immigration and the migrant caravan. I think based on our format, we're rotating who begins each question. Senator Brakey, if you begin the conversation. And if you could, segue out of what the president's saying as well.
Yeah, well certainly, I think in large part, these aren't bad people. Now, they have been traveling through certain areas where there have been identified terrorists, but for the most part, these aren't bad people. Well, now, we don't know who's in there. There needs to be some vetting. But here's the thing. We simply can't, if our goal is to reduce poverty across the world, our immigration system is not a poverty reduction program. You know, frankly, I understand why they want to come here. America's a great nation. Frankly, if I were in their shoes, I'd want to come here too. But if we opened our borders to everyone, we would find that America was at capacity before we actually had even a small dent in the global poverty problem. If we want to fight global poverty, the answer is actually pretty clear. It's capitalism. The advance of free trade across the world has brought us to a point where global poverty rates are at the lowest rates they have ever been in all of human history. We can be the shining city on a hill. We can set a good example, and we can have legal immigration to our country in a limited manner as long as it's done in a way that benefits America. But we have to secure our borders. That's where we must begin.
Zach Ringelstein, the same question to you. You have 1 minute to respond to what we're hearing from the president on this topic as well.
Yes, so I believe that the president and others on this stage are doing some desperate campaigning and are not addressing the real problems in America right now. There is a crisis in this country where 1% of our country owns about half of our wealth. We're about half of Americans can't afford a $400 emergency. With the last 4 years, with the 4 hottest years in human history, we're talking about crises that require urgent attention and that people are ready to pick up and do something about. And yet we're talking about this caravan. Now, these people, refugees across the world, are not just coming off of their cozy couches with their DVR and their Hulu and Netflix. These folks are fleeing violence and war. That's what refugees are. And so we need to be a shining beacon of hope. All of us, I believe, whether you're out there watching TV or here, unless you're indigenous, you came from immigrants. You're descendants, we are descendants of immigrants. And we're oftentimes descendants of refugees. And we better start to show our humanity as Americans.
Thank you very much. And the same question to you, the incumbent Senator King.
This is a very difficult issue, but I think it's important to understand who these people are. Number one, I don't think there's any evidence for what the president said. There may be bad people, but these are people who aren't coming to swim across the river and sneak into America. They're asylum seekers. They're coming here under our laws, presenting themselves at a port of entry and saying, I'm fleeing violence, I fear for my life, and under American law, I'm seeking asylum. There's then a process whereby they're vetted, they have to prove their claim, and they have to go through quite a process before they're admitted to the country. So the idea that these people are just rushing the border, coming through the fence, that isn't true. And it's very important to make that distinction. The second piece is, where are they coming from? Not Mexico. They're coming through Mexico. They're coming from one of the most violent places on earth, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, and they're fleeing for their lives. I think what we need to do is have the process at the border, but also see how we can rebuild some of those societies so they don't have to flee their countries to try to come here.
I do want to ask a follow-up question for each of you, because I think it is very much on topic, and then we'll get to extending maybe some discussion period. As a follow-up, we heard the president say today as well that he believes that perhaps we should reopen the idea of constitutional birthright, the 14th Amendment. I know, Senator Brakey, you've already responded to this today on social media. Do you agree with that we should, and for those at home, basically saying that just because you're born here right now, the Constitution, the 14th Amendment says, you're born in the United States, you become a citizen. The president has suggested that that's a misinterpretation of the Constitution, and that he should be able to write an executive order and thereby undoing that. Let's start with Senator Brakey. What's your thought on constitutional birthright?
Well, a few points I want to make. First of all, Mexico already offered asylum and job opportunities to these individuals, and many of them have rejected that. So that's something else to be considered in this conversation. But when we're talking about birthright citizenship, you know, it is worth noting, you know, in our Constitution, I have it right here, the 14th Amendment, which I support. You know, the 14th Amendment is a cornerstone of our system. It says, all persons born and naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. Now, when we're talking about birthright citizenship, so it's not just enough to be born here, you have to be under the jurisdiction of our country. And so that certainly applies for citizens. That applies for people who are here legally, whether you have a visa or a green card. But if you're here illegally, you're not really under our jurisdiction. You were not legally granted access to our country. And so there is an outstanding legal question that the courts have never weighed in on of whether or not the children of illegal immigrants should be granted automatic citizenship. I think that, personally, I think that devalues what American citizenship is supposed to be.
And same question to Zach Ringelstein, please, on the idea of constitutional or birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment.
So the 14th Amendment is something we must uphold. I grew up in a family where I was the youngest of 4 boys. We qualified for free and reduced lunches, and we worked really hard. I had a Constitution literally in my bathroom. My mom put it there, and she always said, we raise you like the Constitution. And I had to say that it is an utter shame that the president wants to broaden his power to a point where he thinks that he himself can effectively amend the Constitution. That is unconstitutional, it's un-American, and this president is demonstrating that he wants to take us off the cliff of authoritarianism. Somebody's got to stand up to this. Somebody's got to show bold leadership against Donald Trump. I have called already for his impeachment and removal from office, and I believe that is what has to be done, and I am the only person in this race who has said that. I went to a fair a few weeks ago, and I was talking to a couple there, and this was up in Piscataquis County, and they said to me, Mr. Ringelstein, if we can't impeach Trump right now, sadly, I just can't trust our U.S. senators to ever get it done.
Right.
And that is the reality of too many Americans. We can't broaden his authority anymore.
And your 1 minute is up. If I can say the same question to Senator Angus King, please.
The 14th Amendment was designed to be sure that the children of slaves who had been brought to this country were citizens because they were born on our soil. That was the fundamental purpose of that provision. It seems to me it's clear that that applies to anybody who's born on our soil. There are other countries, contrary to what the president said, he said no other countries have this. A lot of other countries have this, including Mexico and Canada. If you're born in the country, you're a citizen. What bothers me about this, though, is the idea that the president, by executive order, can effectively amend the Constitution. I mean, for those who say they're originalists and they believe in the Constitution and the sacredness of the Constitution, This is about as far from a constitutional process as there could be. There is a process in the Constitution to amend it. But if the president feels or other people feel that this isn't a proper part of it, then let's have that debate, go through the Congress and go through the states and amend the Constitution. But the idea that a president can amend the Constitution by executive order should make any conservative's head explode.
Let's extend to Eric Brakey. First of all, do you think that there should be a constitutional process to perhaps amend this, or you think it can be done through executive order?
Well, first of all, in the Maine Senate, I'm known as the champion of the Constitution. I take my oath of office very seriously. In fact, that's why I have one of the most independent voting records in the Maine Senate, because I don't follow party leadership. I don't follow special interests. I follow the Constitution that I swore an oath to uphold. And the Constitution is very clear. The language is there. You must be under the jurisdiction of our country. And if you're here illegally, you are not under our jurisdiction. There is no court precedent on this. Courts have ruled that if you are here as a legal immigrant, if you have a visa or a green card, then yes, your children are granted citizenship. But if you are here illegally, there is no precedent to support that.
Angus King would like to
respond. Are you suggesting that a child born in Maine at Maine Med grows up, is 18 years old, and gets a speeding ticket because their parents weren't citizens? They are not subject to the jurisdiction of Maine? Of course they are. Anybody born here and living here is subject to the jurisdiction of the state. Lawyers can argue about this, and courts can argue about it, but I get back to the basic point. As a conservative, how can you possibly support a president claiming he can amend the Constitution? Does that mean President Obama could have amended the Fifth Amendment or the First Amendment?
There's no amendment to the Constitution going on here. The courts have never weighed in on this. This has been specifically granted by courts to the children of legal immigrants in our country. It has never, the courts have never weighed in on this for those, for the children of those who are here illegally.
A final word from Zach Ringelstein on this topic.
Yeah, I think we have gone so far with this president. We keep saying, okay, sure, okay, sure. When he detained and caged children at the border, what he's trying to do to the LGBTQ community with transgender rights, what he is doing, abroad, what he's doing with the Emoluments Clause, and now he's going to amend the Constitution, and conservatives are going to say that's okay. We have gone way too far. Someone's got to say this is too far. This president should not be able to go any farther, and someone needs to stand boldly to the folks who are letting this happen.
And we're ready to move on unless there's a strong signal feeling like there's a reason to respond. Now, seeing none, let's move on. Our next question comes courtesy of our debate co-sponsors tonight. That's AARP Maine. They asked this: with prescription drug prices continuing to skyrocket, what steps do you plan to take to ensure that older people and their families have affordable access to their life-sustaining drugs? And based again on our rotating order, I believe that at this point we have not started a question with Zach Ringelstein, so let's begin there. You have 1 minute, sir.
Sure. So I was talking to a senior the other day who told me that she had missed getting her insulin because of the cost. The cost has more than tripled since 2002. Insulin. And over about 50% of those who need insulin because of diabetes have missed their treatments because of the cost of insulin. This is in America. This is in the richest country on earth. On top of that, prescription drug costs are over twice as much as the next developed country. Right here in America, we need to make sure that Medicare is able to negotiate prices. It is a crime that they can't. We also need to make sure that we actually have a free market and can have trade with Canada if we're not going to lower prescription drug prices right here in this country. And finally, I am the only person in this race who supports Medicare for all. Healthcare is a human right, and no one should be denied basic access for healthcare or for prescription drugs.
All right, thank you. Same question to you, Senator King, on the question from our friends at the AARP Maine about prescription drugs.
It's a great question, because this is really a tremendous issue for everyone. I met with a group in South Portland a couple of weeks ago, and the fellow had a vial. He was a diabetic, and his vial of insulin cost $40 10 years ago, and today it costs $400. And it's essentially the same product. What's going on? Number one, Medicare should be able to negotiate a volume discount. The law that passed in 2005 providing the drug discount under Medicare prohibited negotiation, which is just crazy. One of the first bills I signed on to was to allow that, and as I mentioned before, that would save the taxpayers $25 billion a year. we should be able to import from Canada. I'm a co-sponsor of a bill on that. They have to be proven safe, but that's an important piece of it. Prices should be disclosed, so people know when you see those fancy ads, they know what the price is. I don't think those, I believe that companies should not be able to deduct the cost of those ads. There are only 2 countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer advertising, U.S. and New Zealand. I think we ought to get out of that club, and we ought to prohibit these companies from gaming the patent system to keep drugs on patent and therefore maintaining their monopoly.
Thank you very much. Same question to you, Senator Brakey.
Yeah, well, the first thing I was going to say is that we do have a lot of companies who abuse the patent system in order to prevent generics from coming to market and to restrict competition. I mean, that's a kind of crony capitalism that exists that we need to fight back against. But one thing that we should not miss in this conversation is just how much the government adds to the cost of these drugs coming to market. The FDA, anytime you try to get a new drug through the system, it costs billions of dollars. It can take 10 years. And the FDA is so risk-averse in allowing new things to come to market that so many things that could help people never actually come out. And they spend so much cost, billions of dollars, just getting through that system. Which is why, as a Maine state senator from Androscoggin County on the Health and Human Services Committee, I ushered through right-to-try legislation to allow terminally ill patients the right to try non-FDA approved medications when they're trying to save their lives if they've exhausted all the available options. At the end of the day, when you're trying to save your own life, you should be able to make your own decision working in conjunction with your doctor as to what you're trying, and government shouldn't stand in your way.
And I see Zach Ringelstein would like to, but can extend for you to make an additional comment.
I have committed to rejecting all pharmaceutical money. In fact, I reject all corporate PAC lobbyist and fossil fuel money. And today, we were able to get from Angus King that he is going to not only give back the money from ExxonMobil and from fossil fuel companies, but he's no longer going to accept it. Now, Angus, you take money from pharmaceutical companies. Will you do the same, make the same commitment on that?
No, because nobody's bought my vote, and if you listen to those things I all listed, if anybody thinks they made a good investment, they made a big mistake. Because I'm supporting everything that the pharmaceutical industry opposes. So
but you don't support Medicare for all?
I do not support Medicare for all. I support health care for all. I'm just not sure Medicare for all is the right path.
And for those at home wondering what Medicare for all is, that is a single-payer plan. I think Bernie Sanders is one who's championed that particular piece of
There's one other piece on this that I think should be mentioned. A lot of the research that underlies some of these drug developments comes from the U.S. government. We spend billions of dollars on medical research, biomedical research around the country. I believe that if the research that's supported by the taxpayers contributes to the creation of a new drug, there should therefore be a benchmark of the world price, not whatever they want to charge here in the United States.
If we can move on, then I think we're ready for our next question as well. As we mentioned a moment ago, we have an additional partner here tonight. That's the Bangor Daily News. I'd like to welcome in my colleague from the BDN, Mike Shepard, to ask our next question. Mike.
Thanks, Greg. Some in Maine's lobster industry say that President Trump's trade war with China is hurting them. What major aspects of the president's trade policy do you support or oppose? And how can Maine's congressional delegation protect the state's interests as trade agreements continue to be altered?
All right, thanks very much. And again, based on our alternating system, I think we're back to Angus King beginning this question, please, from our friends at the BDN.
Well, the question is absolutely right, and it's a perfect example of you better be careful about thinking 3 or 4 steps down the road. The tariffs that were imposed on China, one of the first places they imposed new tariffs was on lobsters. And 20% of our exports of lobsters were going to China, and it was the fastest growing part of our market. So this is a really significant problem, and it's not only a problem if the tariffs were removed tomorrow. The problem is, and I've talked to lobster dealers in Stonington and in Portland and all along the coast, if the tariff was removed tomorrow, they would have lost their customers. The Chinese are now buying from Canada, and so that's why I think I support trying to get a better trade deal with China, but I don't think you do it with a sledgehammer that's going to have unintended, or in this case, pretty obvious consequences that are hurting Maine today.
And we're going to return to Mike for follow-ups in a moment, but first, obviously, we want to have a chance to answer the question. Senator Brakey, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, we should look and see that President Trump's tough trade diplomacy has been working. Through tough trade diplomacy, we've got new and better trade deals with Mexico, with Canada, with the European Union. China's still holding out. I hope that we get a better trade deal before too long. But I've talked with a lot of folks in our lobster industry, and they tell me, you know, we're sick and tired of getting these bad trade deals. And many of the folks I talk to see the long game that's being played. And the point that Senator King makes about them going going to Canada, I talk to lobstermen and say, yeah, so we sell our lobsters up to Canada and then they go to China and we still get paid for our lobsters. Obviously, that's not an ideal solution. Certainly in the short term, trade wars hurt. And it's my hope that we will get a better trade deal in the end, just like we have seen with the European Union, just like we have seen with Canada and Mexico. Trump is tough on trade, and in many places, it's working out.
Thank you very much. Zach Ringelstein, you have 1 minute for the same question, please.
Yeah, so many people know that I was on a 16-county tour this year of Maine. We camped, actually, in every county. And the great thing about camping in Maine is you actually, even though you listen to the news and the radio, you start to realize everyone is good. And I met loggers, I met lobstermen, I met people who are truly living paycheck to paycheck, truly catch to catch out on the sea. And the reality is that this is hurting Mainers' livelihoods. And this is an example of where Donald Trump is overstepping his presidential authority, causing potential conflict where there could be peace. And I would like to see him start to take some responsibility for this and make sure that our lobster industry is not affected one way or another. One of our U.S. senators needs to step up on this issue. It's not good enough to get a lobster emoji. We need real action in the U.S. Senate. This isn't a game. This is real. I'm
going to let Mike ask a follow-up question, though, but if Senator King wants to respond to what he just said.
I'll wait for Mike.
All right. Mike,
Senator King, you were skeptical of NAFTA when you first ran for governor, but 2 years later, while promoting exports, the Portland Press-Herald described you as a backer of free trade. So what has changed, and what are Maine's opportunities in NAFTA renegotiation?
Well, I felt at the time, I was, as you say, skeptical of NAFTA when I was running for governor. NAFTA happened, and my effort as governor was to promote exports because it was part of growing our economy. So I became a real, in fact, one of the very first things we did, along with Republican Senator Phil Harriman, who was then in the state Senate, was create the Maine International Trade Center to help smaller Maine companies trade and work abroad. Exporting has got to be part of it. But the problem with NAFTA, and I think the president had some insight here, was that it was, in many ways, it was one-sided. It wasn't as favorable to our workers and our environment as I thought it should have been. So I don't disagree. This is one of the areas where I agree with the president, where dealing with trade issues is important. The question is, how do you do it? And do you do it in such a way that doesn't have the kind of repercussions that end up being more damaging than the original problem?
And Mike, did you have an additional follow-up, it appeared?
I was going to, Senator Brakey, I mean, you talked about the long game with the President Trump's trade policy. How long is the long game?
Well, hopefully it's not too long. We've seen a lot of these trade deals working out with other countries, as I mentioned. But I want to hit on something here. You know, Angus, I mean, this is kind of how you flip and you flop. You plant yourself on both sides of every issue so that no matter what a person's position is, they can know that you agree with them. You opposed NAFTA in '94. 2 years later, you supported NAFTA, so much so that you were blasting critics of NAFTA.
I supported exporting into the world economy.
Well, we have a quote, and I'd be happy to pull it for you. And then in a recent debate, you tried to take credit for opposing NAFTA when it began. But yeah, you flipped and flopped on this issue, just like so many issues. You know, you put yourself out as an independent. Every time you run for office, you get there, you vote lockstep with Chuck Schumer, and you know, at the end of the day, you're a fake. You're a phony. You're a fraud. You're not being honest with the Maine people. It's time to just stick to a position and take it.
Chance to respond.
Maine people have known me for 25 years. I call them as I see them. I don't vote with Chuck Schumer. I don't vote with Donald Trump. I vote with the people of Maine. And I vote with my conscience.
You're actively...
Hold on.
That's what I've tried to do. And I take positions, and I'm clear about it. And the idea that I waffle now, I'll occasionally change my mind. That's called learning. And that's called evolving and trying to understand the realities at the time. But to say because I helped promote exports from Maine in order to build the economy, that somehow was a flip from being skeptical of NAFTA, that just doesn't pass the straight face.
Yeah, I think it's way too far to call our very respectable senator a fake and a phony. I don't obviously think he has the kind of bold leadership we need in the crisis we're in 2018. But I find that rather inflammatory, and I'd like to give him just a little bit of respect for his service to our state. I'd also like to add that we really need to have some policies here, some actual policies, not just talk around issues. I think that's an important part of this debate and what needs to happen during this crisis.
Eric Brakey's asked to jump in as well.
Yeah. So, Angus, I mean, you say you're an independent, but while you're running for re-election, you're actively fundraising for other Senate Democrats across the country. The only person I see fundraising for Senate Democrats more than you is Chuck Schumer and the people aspiring for Senate Democrat leadership. You campaigned for governor as a fiscal conservative. You left the state of Maine $1 billion in debt after you increased spending 45%. You've racked up $5 trillion on the American people in new debts. As governor, you opposed the individual mandate. Now you support the individual mandate. You flipped and you flopped. You know, every single ideal that you once espoused when you were first running for governor, you've become a complete mockery of. When that happens, it's time to retire.
Let's allow him a chance to respond, please.
Well, it's hard to know where to start with all that. A lot of those things have been litigated, talked about, come up in prior elections. Let's talk about the budget of the state of Maine. In January of 2001, in my last 2 years as governor, I submitted a balanced budget to the legislature, which is what all governors have to do. The legislature passed that balanced budget in the summer or the late spring of 2001. And then something happened. September 11th, 2001. The economy collapsed nationwide. Virtually every state was in trouble, in deep trouble. What did we do? We went back to the legislature, called a special session. We made cuts. We did all the things that we could think of. We used part of the rainy day fund, which is what it was there for, and we ended the year with a balanced budget. This $1 billion shortfall is sort of a mythical number based upon what the legislature or what the people thought they might want to spend in the next 2 years. But the budget was submitted, it was balanced, and September 11th changed everything. It changed everything for every state.
I'm going to allow Eric Brakey a brief extension to comment, if you will, and then I think, in fairness, we're going to end up with Angus King having the final word on this topic.
So the shortfall that you left us in was $1 billion after you increased state spending 45%. That was actually fact-checked by a certain reporter, then at the Kennebec Journal, now at the Bangor Daily News. His name is Mike Shepard. He's in the room here somewhere. That was fact-checked, and it demonstrated to be absolutely true. The situation you left us in, we've been digging out of for the last 16 years. It nearly bankrupted our hospitals. It led us into a long recession that we've been trying to dig out of. Now, over the last several years, as I've been in the Maine Senate, I've helped to cut taxes, reform welfare, get spending under control. We're finally getting out of that, but we still have a lot of work ahead of us. Our kids are still moving away. We need to create the better jobs that have left Maine so we can keep our kids here.
Final word to Senator Angus King.
I'm proud of my record as governor. We added 80,000 jobs in 8 years, lowered taxes by about 15%. We reinvested because I came in at the end of a major recession, so there was a lot of disinvestment in things like the schools. So we reinvested in schools, we reinvested in a lot of our public infrastructure and our highways. So I've got no apologies to make. I'm proud of the work that we did.
We have a lot more discussion to have here. We got to take a quick break. We have some social media questions coming up and a chance for the candidates to ask each other a question. Quick break. We'll be right back in 2 minutes. And welcome back to our Vote 2018 Maine U.S. Senate debate. And as we mentioned, we are getting some questions and comments through social media. Our desk over there. Let's get right to my colleague, Jennifer Long.
Yeah, Greg, the debate has been red hot here in the studio, but a lot of the folks at home have also been debating back and forth with each other about everything from gun control to healthcare, immigration. We do have a question, though, that we want to get to from Gary on Twitter. He used the hashtag #YourVoiceYourFuture if you want to use it at home to ask any questions. Here it is. Gary asks, how can we really tackle our aging and sometimes dangerous infrastructure in this country, and specifically in Maine? Greg, if you could ask that to our candidates.
Okay, great. Thanks very much to Gary for asking the question and everyone participating on social media. Again, I've sort of lost track of where we're starting. I believe we're over here with Zach Rinkelstein. Sure. You have 1 minute to respond to a question about infrastructure.
Oh, sure. So, first of all, this might be the only thing I agree with Trump on. We need to reinvest in our infrastructure. We need a $1 trillion package that makes sure that we have high-speed broadband throughout this state. Young people can't move here without it. And I actually talk to a lot of seniors who can't get a step into this economy without it. I want to add to that we need new transportation lines, et cetera. But I also want to mention for seniors, not just that we need to lower prescription drug costs and protect Medicare, expand it, make sure billionaires are paying into Social Security just like everybody else is. But I want to add that I am the only person on this stage who supports question 1 for elder care. We need to make sure not only that we're supporting our seniors who need to be able to stay in their home and be able to afford it, but also this disproportionately affects veterans who don't get the care they need and should have the dignity of being able to stay home.
All right, thanks very much. For those at home, that's statewide question 1 that'll be on the ballot as well this November. Same question to you, a question from Gary at home about infrastructure.
There's no question that infrastructure is one of the most significant challenges that we face. I wish the president had started his administration with that, because I think we could have come up with a bipartisan solution instead of the divisive repeal the Affordable Care Act. One of the most important parts of infrastructure, and whenever it's discussed in Washington, I raise my hand and say, don't forget broadband. Broadband is the highway of the 21st century. And if we don't do something to strengthen the broadband backbone in Maine, in our rural areas, in small towns, in Dover, Foxcroft, or Milo, or Bethel, we're going to be sunk. Those areas are not going to be able to move forward economically. The other piece that we're talking about is highways, bridges, traditional infrastructure, and we're in real trouble. All those green bridges in Maine, you know, that we cross all the time in rural areas, there's one in Brunswick, they're starting to fail. They were built in the 30s. We've got to start refunding our basic infrastructure and move on to, that's how the economy works. Infrastructure, including broadband, in my view, is the key to the 21st century.
And same question to you, Eric Brakey from Gary at home.
Yeah, here we go again. More big spending from Angus King without any plan for how to pay for it. I certainly agree that we need infrastructure, and I actually have an idea for how we do it. First of all, I support economic freedom zones. In some of the more poorest, more rural, underdeveloped areas of the state, let's cut federal taxes in these areas next to nothing. Let's let the people there keep more of their own money, build up their own economy, and attract investment in. But of course, we're always going to have the problem of the last mile. And that's where we need to look at some of this overseas spending. Frankly, I'm sick and tired of bombing bridges and rebuilding them in other countries. I want to be building bridges here. Let's bring some of this overseas spending home. Let's stop fighting these wars that stretch on for 17 years. We've been in Afghanistan now 17 years. Osama bin Laden's dead. It's time to bring our troops home and celebrate their victory. It's time to stop sending so much money abroad to countries that don't like us very much and burn our flag. It's time to stop subsidizing the defense of wealthy nations that can do more to defend themselves. Let's bring that money home. Let's shore up our infrastructure. Let's shore up Social Security. Let's put in real priorities here in America. Let's put America first.
Did you want to address what he mentioned there about spending?
We can go forward.
All right.
I agree. We've got to find the money, and we've got to make it happen.
All right, let's move on to our next question. Again, this is our format here for the folks at home that can understand. This is a chance for each candidate to ask one of the other candidates a question. So they each get to pick one person here at the stage that they want to ask a question of. And as I said this to the candidates a moment ago, I'll say it to you at home. We're asking them not to have a short speech in the guise of a question. With that said, I believe in our rotating format, the floor begins with Angus King. You have a chance to ask any one of your fellow candidates here a question.
Well, I think what I'd like to ask is what I think is one of the most important questions facing Maine, and I'll ask it of Senator Brakey. What would you do in Washington about the opioid crisis? It's one of the most serious problems. We're losing a person a day. In fact, 4 people nationwide are going to die just while we're talking here during this hour. So what would you do specifically to deal with the opioid crisis that's ravaging Maine?
It is a very important problem, and I've been on the front lines of the opioid crisis in the Maine legislature chairing the Health and Human Services Committee. But I'll tell you, I think in government we often search for very simple answers to problems that are very complex. I'll tell you, I don't know a single person that thinks an act of Congress is going to fix the opioid crisis. Well, because government can only tackle the symptoms. Now, I support increasing access to treatment. I support harm reduction strategies, including making naloxone available over the counter. I've done that as a state senator. But the core problem is that people are getting addicted to drugs because of a sense of hopelessness. People are going through lives without a clear purpose, and they are numbing the pain with drugs that are destroying their lives. Government is never going to give you a purpose. You know, politicians are never going to give you a purpose. In fact, most politicians, the only purpose you serve to them is to re-elect them. But what gives people a purpose in life is work, is family, is community, is a spiritual life. That's where we need to be focusing on. We can supplement with government help, but we need to be focused on community-driven solutions to help people find their purpose and help them get clean and make something of themselves.
As part of our format, you want to say anything about that? Zach Ringelstein, you can jump in.
Yeah, that's the Eric I know. That's the Senator Brakey I know. I am so glad to hear that from you after this weekend and all the hatred and racism. That's great to hear. Thank you.
Did you wish to respond to what he just said at all?
I don't have anything to say to that.
Senator King, anything you wanted to say about the question that you asked of Senator Brakey?
Well, I think there are specific things we can do. 4 out of 5 heroin addicts start with prescription drugs. That tells me that we've got to control the use of prescription drugs. That's number one. Number two, believe it or not, we're only stopping 25% of the drugs that are coming into the U.S. by water because of a lack of assets, not enough Coast Guard cutters. I think that's inexcusable. So that's part of slowing down the supply. The other piece is treatment and availability of treatment. And the final piece is stigma. We've got to understand that people can recover, they do recover, they can be contributing members of our society, and they've got to be able to have an opportunity to rent an apartment and to have a job. And if we can understand that, and I know a lot of people in recovery in Maine, they're contributing citizens, we got to make that happen.
And last word on this, Zach Ringelstein, then we're going to move on.
So first and foremost, we need Medicare for all. We need people to be able to seek treatment without the kinds of costs. We need safe injection sites. We need affordable rehabilitation centers that aren't just for the rich and famous. We need to make sure that Narcan is available and that it doesn't cost $500, $600. We also need to make sure that our economy is strong. There are jobs in rural Maine so that people can have purpose. The other thing is that as a public school teacher, I know that we have traumatized kids with our standardized testing. We need to get rid of standardized testing before high school, and we need to make sure that we have what's called trauma-based instruction in our schools. We need nurturing communities, nurturing families, and nurturing schools.
All right, let's move on. And this next we have a chance for Senator Brakey to ask a fellow candidate a question. You have a chance to, again, set up your question, but please don't give a short speech on it.
Thank you, Greg. Angus, as governor, you left the state of Maine $1 billion in debt, and you said your greatest accomplishment was lifting Maine's mood. As senator, you voted to add $5 trillion in debt. Nonpartisan groups have ranked you one of the biggest spenders in Washington, D.C., and you said your greatest accomplishment is reasonableness. My question is, were these accomplishments worth the huge debts that you've placed on my generation?
I don't think there's any connection between debts and how we conduct ourselves and how we try to get things done. What I've learned in Washington is everybody thinks they're in charge, but nobody is. And what that means is in order to get something done, you've got to talk to people, you've got to know people, you've got to establish relationships, and that's what I've tried to do. We've worked with people on student loans, on solving the deficit for national parks, for drug advertising. All of those things involve bipartisan work, and that's what I've tried to bring to the Senate. That's the only way we're going to solve these problems. And I share with you the concern about the debt, but you're acting like I sort of did it by myself. This was everyone. Well, but everyone. These were bipartisan budget bills that the president signed, and I think it's time, and perhaps you and I can continue to discuss this, but I've concluded that we really need to talk about some kind of balanced budget amendment, not to take effect next year, but to give us time to get to the place where we have the discipline, because it's very easy to cut taxes, it's very easy to spend, and the result is deficits.
I've been told we need to move on to our next question. If there's something very quickly, Senator Brakey.
I'll just say a lot of politicians talk about the need for a balanced budget amendment, but very few are willing to vote for an actually balanced budget.
Let's move on to Zach Ringelstein. You have a chance to ask a fellow candidate a question as well.
Yes, sir. I'd like to address Senator King. And I've heard from a number of Mainers this concern, which is your complicity in the military-industrial complex. A veteran actually called my office crying. He has cancer and says he doesn't qualify for Medicaid, and he can't afford his mortgage. And I know that you obviously recently passed a big mass surveillance bill, reauthorizing mass surveillance. You also added $82 billion to the military budget. I want to know why, and I want to know if you are okay with that Raytheon, which helps fund your campaign, are the bomb makers that are killing children in Yemen. Is that okay with you? And how are you going to address what is a rampant military-industrial complex?
Number one, I voted against the provision to allow those bombs to be used. I voted against the allowance of those to go to Saudi Arabia. Number two, Raytheon's one of our partners at Bath Iron Works. They build those destroyers that keep 6,000 people to work here in Maine.
I understand that.
And I'm supported by both the people that work there and the people that own that company, and I don't apologize for that. In terms of overall military spending, here's the real figure. Military spending as a percentage of our economy, of our GDP, and as a percentage of federal spending is at the lowest level in 70 years. We live in a dangerous world. I'm on the Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee, and it's a scary place out there. Russia is newly aggressive. China is rising, building aircraft carriers, building islands in the South China Sea, challenging open sea lanes. This is serious stuff. The fundamental purpose of government is to keep us safe. I have no desire to send people into harm's way. I think one of my sacred duties is to try to keep them from harm's way, but the best way to keep us safe is deterrence, is so that everybody in the world knows that if they come after us in any way, shape, or form, there's going to be a response. And that's part of the responsibility to keep us safe. That's the fundamental purpose of why we're there.
So you'll continue to take money from defense contractors? I think that's a really important question. You'll continue to take money from defense contractors?
Nobody buys my vote. I've had 22,000 different donations.
That's not how politics work.
I've had 22,000 donations. 80% of them are below $100. Two-thirds of the individual donations came from people in Maine. So, you know.
So I've got to jump in here for a second. I've got to jump in here for a second.
Mr. Ringelstein, and we're running out of time. So Brakey,
so Angus, you know, and we've talked about this before. You say you voted against sending weapons to the Saudis, but you voted for it under Obama. You voted against it under Trump. It seems that your principles seem to change whether a Republican or a Democrat is in the White House.
There's a difference. The difference was the first time it was defensive material for the Saudis. The second time it was materials to be used in Yemen. That's where I drew the line.
The first time there were machine guns, there were machine guns, there were tanks, and these were being used in the war in Yemen. That was murdering children. I mean, there was a school bus of children that was killed in Yemen by weapons that were sold to the Saudis.
That's a point that Zach Ringelstein just made. You've now made it. And a last word, please, Senator King, on this issue.
Well, the last word is that I voted against sending those arms to Saudi Arabia to be used in Yemen.
And they say they were used, though, in fact.
Well, the precision-guided missiles, that's where I voted no. Because when the first authorization, it was before the Yemen war started. It was before Mohammed bin Salman took over. The circumstances changed, in my view, and my vote changed.
That's the final word on this topic. We are now, actually, at this point, there was going to be a lightning round, but we covered so much ground as it was with the candidates speaking that we're going to skip the lightning round because for time's sake, we need to get right to our closing statements. Again, based on our drawing in advance of this, we're going to go from left to right. Each candidate will have 1 minute for a closing statement. There'll be no rebuttal to this, by the way. So the floor is yours, Senator King. You have 1 minute, please.
As I've been traveling Maine for the past 6 years, I realize we have both challenges and opportunities. The opioid crisis, which we've talked about tonight, is a tremendous challenge. Seniors anxious about health care is a tremendous challenge. The problems of our rural economy, particularly with the closure of a number of paper mills, is a tremendous challenge. But there's hope as well. There are new jobs. There are new businesses coming. I was in Dover Foxcroft, a new expanded paper mill, new opportunities coming out of the forests. I think that's important. But there's something else I want to mention. Tonight, just before coming here, was at a ceremony recognizing those people lost in Pittsburgh. What came through? There were 1,000 people there, not all Jewish. And they were there because Maine is a community, and we care about each other. And the term that I heard that really struck me in my heart is tikkun olam, repairing the world. That's our responsibility.
Thank you very much, Senator Brakey. You have 1 minute as well for your closing statement.
We as Maine people have a very important choice this November. We've been getting a rotten deal for Maine for a very long time, and we can choose to renew that rotten deal, or we can get a better deal. You know, Angus, you got rich off of the taxpayers of Maine. You wrote the energy laws as governor, and you then went to work for the very companies that you forced us to subsidize. You're worth $22 million now. You're the richest politician in Maine. And this is what happens. The left says that the problem is big corporations. The right says the problem is big government. But really, it's that revolving door of corporate and government power, people enriching themselves at our expense. I believe in a better deal for Maine. I believe in better jobs so our kids can stay here, and we can achieve that by getting Washington, D.C. out of our way and out of our wallets. I believe in better health care by getting the middlemen out of the way and allowing us to reconnect with our doctors. I believe in more freedom so you can make your own choice in your own life. I think we deserve a better deal. And if you think that Maine people deserve a better deal this November, then I ask for your vote.
Thank you very much. And again, no rebuttals in our closing statements. The final word in this debate will be Zach Ringelstein. The floor is yours.
My name is Zach Ringelstein. I am a teacher. I am a dad. And I believe that this moment of crisis deserves bold leadership. And listen, I've liked Angus King, but he doesn't support Medicare for all. He introduced a pipeline bill. He voted against equal pay for women. And he takes money from banks and from predatory student loan companies. We can do better in 2018. We must do better. Climate change is going to defeat us. It is going to make my children's lives harder. This world is going to be ravaged by drought and floods and war if we don't convert to 100% renewable energy by 2035. We need Medicare for all right now. We can, with ranked choice voting, vote for our hopes. There is no spoiler effect. So I ask that you rank me 1, Angus 2. Let's vote for the future, Maine. We can do it.
Thank you very much. And that's all the time we have. Thanks to the candidates. Thanks to you at home. Thanks to our partners at the BDN and our sponsors, AARP Maine. A reminder, our debate, our live debate right here for the for the gubernatorial candidates will be coming up this Thursday, 7 p.m. In the meantime, have a wonderful evening, everybody.